meter, and awesome. And if I could say, she was a very effective leader at the British Youth Council, and I look forward to seeing where Meter will take the Young Trustees movement. So hey there, everyone. I'm Abiodun Michael, and I'm an outgoing ambassador of the Young Trustees movement, as well as a former chair of charity and current trustee of 2 others. And in some of my voluntary work, I've also been working with getting on board and action for trustee racial diversity on the challenge that we'll be talking about today. So I haven't actually got slides with me today, but I will very briefly ask you all to have a little look at this image, which will hopefully pop up. Okay, so I want everyone, first thing that comes to your mind, have a look at this and tell me how many triangles you see. Let's put the answer in the chat and let's see what we come up with. So 30 seconds, click on that, have a little look. How many triangles do you see? And then we will discuss the answers. 30, 29, 28, 27. Let's keep them going. Let's keep them going. 15, 14, 13. Another 10 seconds. Let's get more answers. We've got 15 people on the call. I only see 6 or 7 responses. We got 10, 16, 10, 14, none, 12, 16, none. All right. So from that exercise, hopefully people didn't read the text below and above the images, but from that exercise, we had loads and loads and loads of responses, Now, kinesis triangle is a sort of optical illusion where there are actually no triangles in the picture. However, the way our mind processes the image makes it want to fill in the spaces in between the lines and the circles. This is a psychological phenomenon where essentially in an uncertain situation where there is an absence of information, our minds work hard to fill in the gaps. And this, I think, is a wider metaphor for board decision-making. We have blind spots, we have experiences that we've been through, we have backgrounds, and then we apply all of these as schema to the situations and decisions that we have to make in front of us. What is the consequence of John, Dave, Michael, etc., sitting around a table, coming with the same blind spots, the same perceptive schema, the same sort of problem-solving ideas? Well, the consequence is you get the same decisions, you get exactly the same appetite for risk, and ultimately you get organizations that stagnate. And this, I think, is the clarion call for better diversity in our sector and more people from more backgrounds, more cognitive, experiential difference around the table in order for us to make better decisions. And so we can avoid a situation where, coming back to the chat, everybody might have seen 10, everybody might have seen 16, everybody might have seen none. Because in any of the situations where everybody had coalesced around an actual number, well, they wouldn't have seen that there were actually no triangles. However, if everybody had been the sort of person who would have seen no triangles, they wouldn't have understood how the vast majority of people had seen that problem. Again, most people put in a number and didn't say 0. So then there may have been a difference, even if that board, this imaginary board of triangle decision makers, had said, we see the world with no triangles in it. Well, the problem is the rest of the world does see triangles and they're making decisions and acting on the basis of that. And so that's why I think diversity is incredibly important. And I know people will be fellow travelers and the converted because you've taken the time to be on this call. And I suppose a bit of what I'm getting across in this section is the case for diversity that you might find where you might have board members who don't agree that you need to diversify your board. That's certainly a challenge that I've faced. You might have people who don't want to commit to advertising expensively in places where you might get a diverse group of people. But these challenges ultimately help boards to make better decisions. And that's why I think it's really important that diversity is respected around the table. So that's the sort of mission of it. But that's all ideological waffle if we can't implement it, isn't it? So I think one of the things that I would really encourage people who are looking to get a more diverse board to do is to use the guides which are being produced currently by Getting on Board, as well as a guide that we've been putting together at Action for Trustee Racial Diversity on how boards can improve their diversity. And a couple of the takeaways that I think would be helpful for me to impart during the short time I've got to speak to you are the notion that we're not actually very good as a sector at recruiting generally. The practice amongst the vast majority of trustee boards, as identified by Rathbones Consulting in their report from a few years ago, was that quite a lot of the trustee vacancies which are advertised in England and Wales are done with a wink and a nudge. They're done by co-opting, they're done by people recruiting from within their networks, and that there isn't actually a widespread established majority practice across our sector of actual open recruitment. And I'd just like to tell a little bit about how, for a charity where I'm a senior manager, not a trustee, I helped to get them on a journey where they could actually implement open trustee recruitment. So essentially, it's a sort of establishment-facing, very traditional organisation where it thinks they have to have the great and the good around the table in order to make any great decisions. Yeah. And that sort of focus on establishment privilege has seemed to exclude quite a few people who think differently, who might well counter the sort of culture of the organisation and ask it challenging questions. And to be honest, I just hated that sort of resort to orthodoxy and thinking because we've done it this way, we always have to do it this way. And said, well, are you sure that you actually have the right skills around the table to make the sorts of decisions that you're looking to make? Are you actually getting to the crux of the issues, or are you having a superficial understanding of them because everyone just nods along? And engaging in that sort of frank conversation with the chair was initially very challenging to him. I didn't get the sort of immediate response that I sought from him, but through helping him to see that it was actually a sort of missed opportunity when the organisation was looking to do stuff digitally and to expand into new markets and to court new audiences, not to have people around the table with those sorts of insights or who come from different sections of society. That sort of argument was really compelling to him. And I think broadly, anyone who's an ally in equality, diversity and inclusion work ultimately has to do that. They have to use whatever argument is going to be compelling to the decision makers in front of them and just pull on whatever the real issues and problems that they have are. Are they concerned about overall performance in the organisation? Are they concerned about the perception in the industry that they don't care about a particular protected characteristic? Some of the stuff I'm starting to see from on high is also really helpful for this argument. So we're starting to see funders who are saying, we will not grant money to organisations with trustee boards that are predominantly white and male. And that has been, again, a sort of compelling ground for bringing new trustees into an organisation that previously doesn't have many of them. And the other thing was making it a key element of our diversity and inclusion policy. I always see open recruitment as a mechanism by which an organisation can open its horizons, as well as its board of directors, to a more broad, widespread section of society. And I made sure that when drafting the EDI space, that we made that a core part of it as well. So that's a little bit about some practical ways that I've sought to try and challenge practices that lead to very undiverse boards. What I want to do now is tell you a little bit about a really interesting and fascinating set of focus groups that I ran last year with Black and Asian chairs of trustee organisations to talk through both that recruitment challenge, but also what happens next how our sector may not be doing its best to keep people from diverse backgrounds who do get onto boards because of the experiences that they have there. Another little tidbit from organizational psychology I wanted to just drop in is a project that Google were doing a few years ago called Project Aristotle. And what they were basically doing was looking at the sort of the little nuggets of what works best from high performing teams, and they looked at quite a few of them. And what they found was that all of this nonsense that people tell you is incredibly important for teams being high functioning and effective aren't actually very important at all. The things they excluded were individual performance, the idea of seniority, the idea that people had been around for a long time and would have tenure, that these things didn't really impact the core reasons that teams performed well, but really it was about being able to bring out the latent talent of all parts of the team by creating an environment of psychological safety where people didn't feel like their arguments would be poo-pooed, people didn't feel like there was ever a stupid question they would ask, and people felt that they could bring the whole of themselves both to the discussion and to work. And much of what I got from this set of focus groups with Black and Asian chairs really made me reflect on that. Some of the things that they were telling me, which may be, I suppose, elements cross-cutting with unconscious bias training and other matters, were that there was really a great significance around what they felt their recruitment was achieving. So for some of them, they felt that they had been part of some tokenistic, essentially box-ticking exercises to say, we have no Black women on the board. If we have Black women on the board, we've solved our diversity problem. Closed shirt, end of discussion, you know, the world's brilliant. And then when those Black women get onto the board, they found that they're still facing the same misogynistic attitudes that the board and organisation had before, and that was part of the reason that there wasn't an environment in which they could fully question and challenge the things that had led to that kind of culture. So recruitment with broader systemic change throughout an organisation, when combined, seem to create a greater success for diverse trustee recruitment than simply seeing the diverse recruitment as an end in itself. There was also an element related to that around intersectionality. So when boards ask themselves interrogative questions about, are we looking at this part of the community, or this part of the community engaged? Are they actually still thinking about all of the protected characteristics that they need to support people with? So one example was one of the chairs who was part of this group. She had joined the board, and she was the first woman brought onto the board, and they're doing quite a lot to educate themselves about how they could support her. But they still had quite a few sort of requirements around when the meetings were, and various kinds of constitutional requirements around how one participates. You got to be there in person, you don't do online meetings. And then there was a sort of element of not appreciating the impact that that could have on her as a working mother. So again, they hadn't thought about, you know, her sort of broader life as impacting her ability to do the role. So they hadn't created an environment that would actually facilitate her being able to perform in the role. Again, there are other sort of things that came from the focus group that I think aren't new, aren't novel, aren't groundbreaking, but I think are important to remind ourselves of. Some of the stuff that they were telling me was that there are some really deep-baked power dynamics in the boards of some of the bigger charities, for example, who seem to have a sort of, again, very much like my experience with the charity I was discussing, a cloying desire to speak to the powerful, to have fancy dinners, etc., that may well compromise their mission, or might mean that they're not pushing the interests of their beneficiaries as much as they can. So if one is a campaigner or an activist coming into that environment, you're actually not doing anything to improve the psychological safety of the environment, because that person still has to say, well, this is the importance of lived experience. Yes, you recruited me, but you're not thinking about the effects of the most disadvantaged of this policy, etc. And that actually there are still things around sensitivity or nuance in the way that you think about how policies will affect people that can mean it's very, very frustrating to be the only Black person in the room where you're talking in a sort of pejorative way about how poor Black people are, for example. The language of the board matters. So these are a few of the takeaways that we got from our discussions with Black and Asian chairs. And I found the experience really gratifying, not only because I have experienced many of the challenges myself, both as a chair and as trustee, but also I hadn't really had the opportunity to speak about these things before. And that's something I would really encourage people to do. A lot of people are scared to have discussions about how protected characteristics and trusteeship interact, but we can't educate ourselves without actually asking people directly how things affect them and finding out if we ourselves are part of the problem. And I would really encourage people to, in addition to doing the sort of semi-scholarly activity of reading reports, to actually engage with your beneficiaries, engage with your, whoever the end recipient of your product is or service, and ask them how they can get more involved in the work that you're doing, and also if their voice is coming through to your board. That piece I think is really important, because one of the sorts of diversity I don't think we get much in boards is diversity of different levels of the stakeholder community feeding through to board level. I think as a sector over the years, we've got better and better at involving people beyond the immediate board members.
Thank you, Abiodun. I'm sorry, I could listen to you forever, but I'm going to have to call time. Thank you for sharing. And I just want to share where that links in really nicely to the next part of the session. First of all, thank you so much for coming and sharing so generously your insights and tips to support our wonderful peer space over here. There were some key questions that came through in the registration form that I think this links to. So number one, like, where do you start making the board a welcoming space for young people? And it comes to that point of retention as well. I think what you touched on there was a lot of like, often you will see people continuing to make the same mistakes. So it's not like just like we've made a mistake, but it's like we're continuing to make the same mistakes. So it's like, how can you learn from your like previous mistakes, because mistakes will happen, but how do we ensure that it doesn't happen again and these experiences aren't being repeated? And we can talk a bit more in the deep dive peer session if anybody's facing those as how we can do that. But the second thing is the board ready to create a welcoming space for young people? And what we do, what we have is a conversations toolkit, and part of that toolkit outlines where your board are in certain spaces. Are you red, which means that this is actually an immediate issue and we need to work on it now? Are you orange, where it's like, well, we can start recruiting people, but this is something that we need to work on as we go along? And what areas are green that we actually need to celebrate and say we should continue to keep doing this and making sure that we don't lose some of those perspectives? Thank you again for sharing so generously, Abiodun. I know you need to go. I'm going to pause the recording here, stop the recording even.